There's a skeleton in the vaults beneath the Smithsonian institution that officially doesn't exist. 9 feet tall, with a jawbone so massive it could fit over the face of a modern human like a mask. In 1883, a team of archaeologists working in West Virginia's burial mounds carefully documented their discovery, photographed the remains, packed the bones into wooden crates, and shipped them to Washington. The receipt was signed, the photographs were filed, the bones arrived, and then, according to every official record that followed, none of it ever happened. The skeleton simply ceased to exist. No catalogue number, no storage location, no explanation, just silence. This isn't an isolated incident. Across the span of 2 centuries, over 1,000 similar discoveries have been reported from burial mounds stretching from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico. Newspaper accounts describe skeletons 7, 8, 9 feet tall, some with double rows of teeth, others with skulls so large they defied anatomical possibility. Each discovery meticulously documented by local historians, witnessed by dozens of townspeople, examined by physicians and scientists, and each one, after being shipped to the Smithsonian for further study, disappeared from the historical record as if it had never existed at all. The pattern is too consistent to be coincidence. Something about what they represented threatened a carefully constructed narrative about who we are and where we came from. What if these weren't simply unusually tall humans? What if they were evidence of something far stranger? What if they were the physical remnants of a bloodline that should never have existed? A forbidden mingling of 2 worlds that ancient texts describe with remarkable consistency across cultures and millennia. The Book of Genesis offers 4 cryptic verses. The Book of Enoch provides 100 pages of horrifying detail. Sumerian tablets describe the same event from a different perspective, with different names but identical themes. Fallen beings, human women, hybrid offspring, giants who consumed everything in their path. A world so corrupted by this unnatural union that it had to be wiped clean by water. The biblical Nephilim and the Sumerian Anunnaki might not just share thematic similarities. They might be the same story, told by different witnesses, preserved in different languages, but describing the same cosmic crime. Tonight, as your breathing slows and the day's concerns begin to fade, we'll walk the shadowed corridors where archaeology meets mythology, where ancient whispers echo in museum basements, where the line between history and conspiracy blurs into something unsettling and strangely compelling. Close your eyes if you wish. You won't need visuals for this. The world we're building exists better in the quiet spaces between sleep and waking, where mysteries can breathe without the harsh light of certainty forcing them into submission. Before we descend deeper into this rabbit hole, if this story resonates with you, a quiet like helps others find these mysteries. I'm curious, where in the world are you drifting off from tonight? What time is it there? Leave a thought in the comments. And remember, the visuals here are optional companions. This journey unfolds best in the theatre of your own imagination, in that liminal space where ancient truths and modern doubts dance together in the dark. Now, let the story unfold. The story begins, as so many of these stories do, with silence. Not the silence of absence, but the silence of deliberate erasure. It begins in small towns across America in the 1800s, where farmers ploughing fields would strike something hard beneath the soil, where workers excavating for railroad beds would uncover chambers that shouldn't exist, where children playing near riverbanks would discover bones that dwarfed their own skeletons by impossible margins. The Charleston Daily Mail in West Virginia, the New York Times, the Indianapolis News, small-town gazettes from Ohio to Oklahoma. Between 1830 and 1930, hundreds of newspapers across America reported the same unsettling discovery. Burial mounds, when excavated, contained human skeletons of extraordinary size. Not 7 feet, which is tall but explicable, 8 feet, 9 feet. Some reports, admittedly sensational and difficult to verify, claimed discoveries of remains measuring 12, even 15 feet in length. The Smithsonian Institution, founded in 1846 and tasked with advancing knowledge, and preserving America's scientific heritage, became the primary recipient of these unusual finds. Field agents were dispatched. Professional archaeologists documented the discoveries. Official reports were filed in the institution's annual ethnology bulletins. And here's where the story becomes genuinely strange. Those same reports that carefully catalogued these discoveries would, in later editions, have key details quietly removed. The mention of unusual height would disappear. The photographs would be archived in restricted collections. The bones themselves would vanish into storage facilities that, when later inquired about, had no record of ever receiving them. In 1873, the Smithsonian's own annual report documented a skull discovered in Anna, Illinois, with a circumference of 36 inches. An average human skull measures approximately 20 inches around. This wasn't a case of disease or deformity. The entire skeleton was proportionally enlarged. The report was filed, and then it ceased to exist in any subsequent documentation. Dr. Alesh Hrdlicka, curator of anthropology at the Smithsonian in the early 20th century, became the institution's most vocal skeptic of giant discoveries. In 1934, he published a scathing dismissal of what he called the giant hoax, blaming the proliferation of such reports on the will to believe, combined with amateur anthropology and newspaper sensationalism. He argued that every alleged giant skeleton could be explained by one of three causes: misidentification of extinct megafauna, particularly mastodon bones, medical conditions like acromegaly or gigantism that can produce individuals of unusual height, or outright fraud perpetrated by showmen and hoaxsters seeking publicity or profit. His explanation became the official position. It remains the official position today. And for most mainstream archaeologists and historians, this explanation is perfectly satisfactory. The giant skeleton stories are folklore, the product of an era when scientific rigor was less established, when newspapers competed for readership through sensational claims, when the desire to prove biblical narratives or lost civilizations overwhelmed objective analysis. But there's a problem with this tidy dismissal. It doesn't account for the sheer volume of reports. Over 1,000 documented instances across 200 years. It doesn't explain why so many of these discoveries came from trained professionals, including medical doctors, state geologists, and Smithsonian's own field researchers. It doesn't address why the pattern of disappearance is so consistent, why so many of these carefully documented finds simply vanished after being transferred to institutional custody. And most troubling of all, it doesn't engage with the persistent thread that runs through the oral traditions of nearly every Native American culture across the continent. The Osage tell stories of them. The Paiute have detailed legends of red-haired giants who lived in caves and terrorized their ancestors until they were finally trapped and destroyed. These aren't vague myths. They're specific historical accounts passed down through generations, describing encounters with beings of enormous size and often hostile intent. The conspiracy theory that emerged from this pattern is straightforward. The Smithsonian, acting either on its own initiative or under direction from government entities, systematically suppressed evidence of a giant race that once inhabited North America. Because such evidence would overturn established timelines of human migration and development, because it would challenge evolutionary theory by suggesting that human-like beings of radically different proportions coexisted with modern humans, because it would lend credence to biblical and other ancient accounts of Nephilim, of giants in the earth in those days, of a pre-flood world fundamentally different from our own. In 2014, a satirical website published a fake news article claiming that the Supreme Court had forced the Smithsonian to admit to destroying thousands of giant skeletons in the early 1900s. The article was completely fabricated. It was debunked within days. And yet it went viral, shared millions of times across social media, because it confirmed what a substantial portion of the population already suspected: that somewhere in the climate-controlled storage facilities beneath Washington, in restricted archives that the public can never access, the evidence exists, the bones that prove we've been lied to about the nature of human history. Whether this conspiracy theory is true is almost beside the point. What matters, for our purposes tonight, is that it establishes a crucial foundation, that there might have been, in the relatively recent past, beings who walked this continent, who were fundamentally different from modern humans, built on a scale that our current understanding of human biology suggests should be impossible. If such beings existed, the next question becomes unavoidable. Where did they come from? For that answer, we need to leave the burial mounds of the American Midwest and travel much farther back in time. We need to go to the oldest library in the world, not a building, but a scattered collection of texts preserved in clay, in leather, in papyrus. Texts that describe, with unsettling specificity, the origin of a race of giants that once terrorized the ancient world. Texts that were once considered scripture, that shaped the worldview of entire civilizations, but were later deemed too strange, too disturbing, too dangerous to remain in the canon of accepted holy books. We need to go to the Book of Enoch. The Book of Enoch is not in your Bible. If you're Christian, unless you belong to the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, you've probably never encountered this text in a religious context. It was excluded from the Hebrew Bible, rejected by most Christian denominations during the formation of the biblical canon, dismissed as pseudepigrapha, falsely attributed writing with no legitimate claim to divine inspiration. And yet, it was enormously influential in the ancient world. The New Testament quotes from it. The Epistle of Jude directly references Enoch's prophecies. The Apostle Peter alludes to its account of fallen angels. The Dead Sea Scrolls, discovered in the caves of Qumran in 1947, contained multiple copies of the Book of Enoch, suggesting it was studied and revered by at least some Jewish communities in the centuries around Christ's lifetime. Whatever one believes about its theological status, it was clearly important to the people who lived closest to the events it describes. The book claims to be written by Enoch, the great-grandfather of Noah, a figure who appears briefly in Genesis as a man who walked with God, for God took him. A mysterious figure who apparently never died, but was translated directly into heaven. According to this text, during his celestial journey, Enoch was shown visions of the past and future. He was given knowledge of the workings of the cosmos, the movements of stars, the structure of the heavens, and he was told the true history of a cosmic rebellion that would lead directly to the Great Flood. The account begins with a group of angels called the Watchers. 200 of them, according to the text, assigned by God to observe humanity and record their deeds. They were meant to watch from a distance, to serve as witnesses of human development, but never to intervene. But watching, it turns out, was not enough. The text describes how these watchers, looking down from their heavenly station, saw the daughters of men, human women, beautiful and alluring in a way that celestial beings had never encountered. Sexual desire, physical lust, something that should have been incomprehensible to spiritual entities, began to corrupt their purpose. One of them, a watcher named Semyaza, proposed a terrible idea. Why should they merely observe? Why not descend and experience the physical realm for themselves? But Semyaza was afraid. Afraid that if he alone descended and committed this transgression, he would bear the full weight of divine punishment. So he proposed a pact. All 200 watchers would swear an oath, binding themselves together in this rebellion. They would all descend. They would all take human wives. They would share the guilt, and whatever consequences followed. The oath was sworn on Mount Hermon, a mountain that still exists on the border between Lebanon and Syria, whose name in Hebrew means forbidden place. And then they fell, not metaphorically, not spiritually. According to the Book of Enoch, they physically descended from heaven to earth, abandoned their incorporeal nature, took on physical forms, and did exactly what they had promised. They saw women who pleased them and took them as wives. And from these unnatural unions, children were born, but these were not ordinary children. The text describes them with a mixture of fascination and horror. They grew at an impossible rate. By the time they reached maturity, they stood between 300 and 450 feet tall. This is clearly hyperbole, poetic exaggeration meant to convey incomprehensible size. But even if we divide these numbers by 10, by 20, we're still talking about giants of extraordinary proportions. Beings who towered over normal humans like adults over infants. These hybrid offspring were called the Nephilim. In Hebrew, The word means fallen ones, derived from the verb nafal, fallen from the natural order of creation into something monstrous and wrong. The Nephilim were not gentle giants. They were not benevolent guardians watching over fragile humanity. They were predators. According to the Book of Enoch, they consumed prodigious quantities of food, eating everything that humans produced. When the livestock were gone, they began devouring the animals of the field, the fish of the sea, the birds of the air. And when all of that was exhausted, they turned on humanity itself. They became cannibals, consuming human flesh. The text even suggests they turned on each other, the stronger Nephilim hunting and eating the weaker ones. But the corruption wasn't limited to physical violence. The Watchers, in addition to taking human wives, taught humanity knowledge that was never meant for us. Not all knowledge, specific forbidden knowledge. One Watcher, named Azazel, taught humans the art of warfare, how to forge swords and knives, how to make shields and breastplates. Another taught sorcery and the cutting of roots, presumably for poisons or dark magic. Another taught astrology, the reading of signs in the heavens, which might sound benign but was considered a form of divination, an attempt to control or predict the will of the divine. Women were taught specific skills, the art of cosmetics, how to enhance their beauty artificially, the use of precious stones and dyes. These teachings might seem trivial compared to warfare and sorcery, but they're listed alongside them as equally corrupting. Why? Because they represent vanity, deception, the use of external adornment to manipulate perception. They represent a turn away from what is natural toward what is artificial. The underlying theme is clear. The Watchers accelerated human development in ways that humanity was not ready to handle. They gave us technologies and knowledge that should have emerged gradually, organically, over millennia of slow progress. Instead, we were handed everything all at once, and we used it to destroy ourselves and the world around us. The text describes the earth crying out, the planet itself groaning under the weight of the violence and corruption unleashed by the Nephilim. The archangels in heaven, Michael, Gabriel, Raphael, and Uriel, hear this cry and bring it before God. And God looks down at what has happened to his creation and makes a decision. This cannot continue. The Nephilim must be destroyed. The Watchers must be punished. But before the destruction, there is judgment. Enoch himself is summoned to deliver the verdict. He confronts the Watchers, who are now trembling with fear, their faces covered in shame. He reads to them their sentence. They will have no peace, no forgiveness, no ascent back into heaven. Their hybrid children, the Nephilim, will be destroyed, forced to fight each other until none remain. And the Watchers themselves will be bound in chains of darkness, imprisoned in a subterranean pit in the desert called Dudael, where they will remain until the final day of judgment, when they will be cast into eternal fire. The angel Raphael is given the specific task of binding Azazel, the ringleader who taught the arts of war. He is to be thrown into a pit of sharp and jagged rocks, his face covered so that he sees no light, and left there in complete darkness until the end of days. The other Watchers receive similar fates, imprisoned in various locations beneath the earth. Their punishment, a preview of what would later be called hell. And then comes the flood. God instructs the angel Uriel to warn Noah, the one righteous man remaining on earth, to build an ark and save himself, his family, and the seed of all living creatures. The flood is not, in this telling, primarily a punishment for human sin, though human wickedness is certainly part of the picture. The flood is a necessary act of purification. The world has been contaminated by the Nephilim, by their violence, by their unnatural existence. The blood of these hybrid beings has soaked into the very earth. The only solution is to wash it all away. But here's where the story takes a darker turn, one that echoes into our present investigation. The Book of Enoch states that while the Nephilim's physical bodies were destroyed in the flood, their spirits did not die. Because they were hybrids, neither fully angel nor fully human, the normal rules of death did not apply to them. Their spirits became something else, disembodied entities, wandering the earth, seeking bodies to inhabit, causing trouble wherever they went, later Jewish tradition. and eventually Christian demonology, would identify these spirits as demons. Not Satan and the angels who fell with him in a separate cosmic rebellion, but the spirits of the dead Nephilim, condemned to wander the earth without rest, forever seeking to reclaim the physical existence that was taken from them. This is why demons in the New Testament are described as seeking to possess humans, why they beg Jesus not to cast them into the abyss, but instead send them into a herd of pigs. They need physical form. They crave it, because they are the ghosts of giants, forever denied the bodies they once inhabited. This is the story the Book of Enoch tells. It's vivid, it's detailed, it's disturbing in its specificity, and it provides a narrative framework that, if true, would explain an enormous number of otherwise inexplicable elements in both ancient texts and archaeological anomalies. But there's a problem. Well, several problems. The first is that this is only one tradition. The Book of Enoch represents a particular strain of Second Temple Jewish thought, influential but not universally accepted even in its own time. Other ancient Jewish scholars proposed different explanations for Genesis chapter 6. Some argued that the sons of God were not angels at all, but the righteous descendants of Seth, who intermarried with the corrupt descendants of Cain. Others suggested they were human rulers and kings who, in their arrogance, claimed divine status and took multiple wives. The second problem is biological. Angels, according to traditional theology, are incorporeal spirits. They don't have bodies. They don't have DNA. How exactly would they reproduce with human women? Jesus himself states that angels neither marry nor are given in marriage. While the Book of Enoch describes the Watchers taking on physical form, this raises more questions than it answers. Were these temporary bodies, or did descending to Earth fundamentally change their nature? The third problem is one of scale and verification. The 300 to 450 feet tall giants, described in Enoch, are physically impossible. Square cube law dictates that a being of that size would collapse under its own weight. Its bones would shatter. Its heart couldn't pump blood to its brain. Even if we assume massive poetic exaggeration, even if the real Nephilim were only 9 or 10 feet tall, we're still talking about beings at the extreme edge of what human physiology can support. And yet, despite these problems, despite the theological debates and the biological impossibilities, the story persists. And more than that, it echoes across cultures and millennia in ways that are difficult to dismiss as mere coincidence. Which brings us to Sumer, to Mesopotamia, to the oldest written language in the world, carved into clay tablets 4,000 years before Christ, to a completely different culture with a completely different religion, telling what appears to be the same story with different names. Sumer was ancient when Babylon was young. It emerged in southern Mesopotamia, in the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, in what is now Iraq, sometime around 4500 BC. This is the dawn of recorded history. Everything before this point is prehistory, knowable only through archaeology and reconstruction. But the Sumerians invented writing, and with writing came the ability to preserve not just accounts and records, but stories, myths, cosmologies, explanations for how the world came to be and humanity's place within it. At the center of Sumerian mythology is a group of deities called the Anunnaki. The name, in Sumerian, means princely offspring, or those of royal blood. They were described as the children of An, the god of the sky, and Ki, the goddess of earth. But here's the crucial detail. Ki was not originally considered divine. She was, at least in the earliest versions of the myth, mortal. She was later deified, elevated to goddess status. But the texts suggest she began as something else, as the earth itself, or as a personification of humanity emerging from the earth. This means the Anunnaki, in their original conception, were demigods, half divine, half earthly, born from the union of a sky god and a mortal female. Does this sound familiar? It should. It's the same basic structure as the Nephilim story. Divine beings taking earthly mates and producing hybrid offspring. The Anunnaki served various functions in Sumerian mythology. They were the seven who decreed the fates. They sat in divine council and made decisions that determined the course of human history. They were associated with the underworld and with judgment, and while mainstream Sumerologists understand them simply as the principal deities of the Sumerian pantheon, there's a growing recognition that their role was more complex, more ambiguous than a straightforward pantheon of gods. In some texts, they're described as judges, in others as warriors, in still others as builders and teachers who brought civilization to primitive humanity. And it's this last role that becomes particularly relevant to our investigation tonight. The ancient Mesopotamian texts describe a time before the Anunnaki, when humans lived as primitive hunter-gatherers. Then, the gods descended. They taught agriculture, irrigation, architecture, the working of metals, the measuring of time, and the tracking of celestial bodies. All the foundational skills that separate civilization from barbarism were, according to these texts, gifts from the Anunnaki. But there's a darker thread in these stories. A text called the Atrahasis Epic tells of a time when the Anunnaki had a problem. Massive amounts of labor for their construction projects and their mining operations, particularly for gold. The junior gods, called the Igigi, were initially assigned this work, but after centuries of toil, they revolted. They burned their tools and surrounded the house of Enlil, the chief of the Anunnaki, demanding an end to their enslavement. The solution proposed by Enki, the wise god of water and knowledge, was remarkable in its cynicism. Instead of punishing the rebellious Igigi, they would create a new workforce, a being designed specifically for labor, intelligent enough to follow instructions, but not so intelligent as to question or rebel, strong enough to dig and carry, but inherently subservient to the gods. This being would be created by mixing the essence of a god, specifically the blood and spirit of a slain lesser deity named Wee-Ilu, with clay taken from the earth. The mixture would be shaped into human form and implanted into the womb of the goddess Ninti, who would serve as the first surrogate mother. 7 males and 7 females would be created this way, the first humans, designed from the beginning to be workers, servants, slaves to the gods. This is the Sumerian creation account. Humanity was not formed in love. We were engineered for a purpose. We are, in this telling, a genetically modified organism created by more advanced beings to serve their economic interests. Now, step back and look at both stories side by side. In the Hebrew tradition, angels descend to earth, take human wives, and produce hybrid offspring called Nephilim. In the Sumerian tradition, gods called Anunnaki walk among humans and create a new race by mixing divine essence with earthly material. Different cultures, different languages, different time frames, but the same basic pattern: divine beings, earthly females or earthly material, hybrid offspring that are fundamentally different from normal humans. Is it possible these are the same event described from different perspectives? In 1976, a Russian-born Israeli author named Zecharia Sitchin published a book called The 12th Planet. In it, he proposed exactly this connection. He argued that the Anunnaki were not gods, but extraterrestrial beings from a planet called Nibiru. They came to Earth roughly 450,000 years ago seeking gold to repair their planet's deteriorating atmosphere. They established mining operations, primarily in southern Africa. They created the first humans as a worker race through genetic engineering, mixing their own DNA with that of Homo erectus, the primitive hominid already present on Earth. For millennia, according to Sitchin, the Anunnaki ruled directly over humanity, served as our kings and queens, our teachers and masters. The memories of this time were preserved in Sumerian texts, in Egyptian records, in myths around the world. What scholars read as mythology, Sitchin read as literal history. What archaeologists dismissed as primitive religious thinking, Sitchin interpreted as accurate accounts of advanced technology described in the only vocabulary available to ancient peoples. Sitchin's work was almost universally rejected by mainstream scholars. Sumerologists tore apart his translations, pointing out that he frequently mistranslated words, took phrases out of context, or invented meanings that had no basis in the language. His astronomical claims about the planet Nibiru were dismissed by physicists as impossible, A planet on the highly elliptical orbit, he described, passing through the inner solar system every 3,600 years, would have destabilized the orbits of the other planets long ago. We would see its gravitational effects even if we couldn't see the planet itself. And yet, Sitchin's books sold millions of copies. They spawned a whole industry of ancient astronaut theories. They influenced popular culture, from television shows to video games to conspiracy theories that persist to this day. Because even if his specific translations and claims were flawed, he was asking a question that resonated with people. What if the gods were real? What if they were not supernatural beings but visitors from another world? What if human civilization didn't develop gradually and naturally but was jump-started, taught, guided by something or someone with knowledge far beyond what Stone Age humans should have possessed? And here's where we can draw a connection that Sitchin himself didn't fully explore, but others have since proposed. What if the Watchers, the fallen angels of the Book of Enoch, and the Anunnaki are the same group seen through different cultural lenses? What if the Nephilim, the giants in the earth, weren't destroyed in the flood, but merely reduced in number, their bloodline continuing in diluted form through the descendants of those who survived? What if the giant skeletons found in American burial mounds, the ones that were carefully documented and then disappeared, were not some unrelated anomaly but the last physical evidence of this ancient hybrid race? Consider the parallels. Both the Watchers and the Anunnaki are described as coming from above, from the heavens or the sky. Both take an interest in humanity that goes beyond mere observation. Both are associated with teaching forbidden knowledge, advancing human civilization in ways that later prove destructive. Both produce offspring that are larger and stronger than normal humans. Both stories end with a great flood that nearly destroys all life on Earth. In the Book of Enoch, after the Nephilim are destroyed, God tells Noah that a remnant will survive, not of the Nephilim themselves, but of their influence, their corruption. The earth will be cleansed, but not completely. Later biblical texts describe giants still present in the land of Canaan when the Israelites arrive. The Anakim, the Rephaim, Goliath and his brothers, giants in the earth, even after the flood. In Sumerian texts, after the great deluge that nearly destroys humanity, the Anunnaki continue to interact with humans, but less directly. They establish the institution of kingship, placing their own bloodline on thrones to rule in their stead. The king lists of Sumer describe rulers with impossibly long lifespans reigning before the flood, then progressively shorter reigns after, suggesting a gradual dilution of whatever divine or otherworldly element had extended their lives. What if these post-flood giants, these remnants, were the product of Anunnaki-Human hybridization that predated the flood and survived it in some form? What if the sons of God who descended and took human wives were not fallen angels in the Christian sense, but surviving Anunnaki? Either the original visitors or their immediate descendants, still possessing enough of their otherworldly heritage to produce offspring of unusual size and strength? This would explain why giant legends are not confined to the Middle East. Why nearly every ancient culture, from Greece to India to the Americas, has stories of giants in their past. Why the physical evidence, disputed and vanished, though much of it may be, keeps appearing across continents and millennia. The Greek titans who warred against the Olympian gods and were eventually imprisoned beneath the earth. The Jotun of Norse mythology, giant beings who constantly threatened the realm of men and gods alike. The Fomorians of Irish legend. The Rakshasa of Hindu epics. All described as beings of enormous size, great power, and often monstrous appetites. All eventually defeated and driven away or destroyed, but leaving behind a legacy of fear and stories that persist for thousands of years. In Native American tradition, particularly among the Paiute people of Nevada, there are detailed oral histories of a race called the Site-Ka, red-haired giants who lived in caves and terrorized the Paiute ancestors. According to the legend, the Paiute tribes eventually united, trapped the giants in a cave called Lovelock Cave, and burned them alive. When archaeologists excavated Lovelock Cave in the early 1900s, they found, among other artifacts, red-haired mummies and bones that were unusually large. The cave had definitely been used for burial. Whether the bones were truly gigantic or merely tall is disputed. What isn't disputed is that the Paiute oral history, preserved for centuries before any archaeological dig took place, accurately described the location and some of the physical characteristics of what was found there. This brings us to perhaps the most unsettling aspect of the giant hypothesis. If these beings existed, if they were the product of some form of hybridization between different kinds of entities or species, what happened to them? Did they simply die out? Were they hunted to extinction? Or did they do something far more insidious? Did they integrate? There's a concept in alternative history circles called the bloodline theory. It proposes that the hybrid bloodline of Anunnaki-Human offspring didn't disappear. It went underground. The theory suggests that the divine right of kings, the concept that certain families are inherently suited to rule, is not just political propaganda, but a remnant memory of actual genetic differences. That royal families, particularly those who obsessively maintained pure bloodlines through centuries of careful marriage alliances and even incest, were trying to preserve something, a genetic heritage that traced back to the Anunnaki, or the Nephilim, or whatever we want to call these ancient hybrids. This theory has been seized upon by some of the worst elements of conspiracy thinking, twisted into racist ideologies about superior bloodlines and master races. That corruption doesn't make the underlying question less interesting, just far more fraught. Were certain human populations, or certain family lines, descended from beings that were not entirely human? And if so, what genetic markers might still persist? In 2003, an international team of geneticists working on the Human Genome Project made an announcement that went largely unnoticed by the general public, but sent ripples through the scientific community. They had identified a set of genes, roughly 223 of them, that appeared in the human genome, but had no corresponding precursor in any of the primate species from which humans supposedly evolved. These genes didn't fit the neat evolutionary tree. They seemed to have appeared suddenly, with no gradual development from simpler precursor forms. The scientific explanation for this anomaly is horizontal gene transfer. The hypothesis that these genes were acquired from microorganisms, bacteria and viruses that infected our ancestors and incorporated their genetic material into our DNA. This is a known biological mechanism. It happens. The question is whether it adequately explains the number and complexity of the genes in question. Some researchers proposed an alternative explanation, that these genes represent genetic material from an unknown hominin species that interbred with Homo sapiens. We know this happened with Neanderthals and Denisovans. The DNA of both these extinct human cousins is present in modern humans. What if there was another contributor, a hominin species that was radically different in some way, different enough that its genetic signature stands out as anomalous? Now, to be absolutely clear, there is no mainstream scientific support for the idea that these genes came from extraterrestrial or supernatural sources. The ancient astronaut theory is not accepted by geneticists or evolutionary biologists. The horizontal gene transfer explanation, while still debated in its specifics, is far more plausible and requires no appeal to extraordinary causes. But the existence of genetic anomalies, of unexplained elements in our own DNA, opens a door for speculation. If hybridization between two radically different populations did occur in the distant past, genetic evidence might be the only undeniable proof that would survive millennia. And that evidence would look exactly like what we're seeing: genes that don't fit the expected pattern, that appear suddenly, that suggest an origin outside the normal evolutionary pathway. Let's return to the physical evidence, because that's where this entire investigation began. If giant skeletons were found, really found, in numbers that suggest a population rather than isolated medical anomalies, where are they? The Smithsonian explanation, articulated most forcefully by Dr. Hrdlicka in the 1930s, is that the vast majority of giant skeleton reports were mistakes or hoaxes. Mastodon bones were frequently misidentified as human because of their size and the way they break down over time. A mastodon femur, fragmentary and weathered, can resemble a human bone if you don't know what you're looking at. In the 1800s, when paleontology was still a young science and many people excavating mounds were amateurs, such mistakes were common. Some reports were outright fabrications, created by showmen who toured exhibits of giant bones for profit. P. T. Barnum, the famous circus impresario, exhibited what he claimed was the petrified body of a giant from the Cardiff giant hoax. This was later revealed to be a sculpted gypsum fake, but not before thousands of paying customers had viewed it. Other reports were exaggerations, tall tales that grew in the telling, especially when filtered through the sensationalist newspapers of the era. A skeleton of an unusually tall individual, perhaps someone 6.5 or 7 feet in height, which is rare but not impossibly so, becomes 8 feet in the first newspaper account, 9 feet in the retelling, 12 feet by the time it reaches a national publication. And then there are legitimate cases of individuals with gigantism, a medical condition caused by excessive growth hormone production. Robert Wadlow, the tallest verified human in history, reached 8 feet 11 inches before his death in 1940 at age 22. His skeleton was not preserved, cremated at his family's request specifically to prevent it from being exhibited. But other individuals with similar conditions have existed throughout history, and their remains, if discovered by people unfamiliar with the condition, might well be described as giant skeletons. All of these explanations are reasonable. Many of the reported giant skeletons probably do fall into one of these categories. The question is whether all of them do, whether there's a residue of cases that don't fit these neat explanations. Cases where trained professionals documented the discovery, where photographs were taken, where measurements were careful, and multiple witnesses corroborated the findings. Where the bones were anatomically correct human skeletons, not misidentified megafauna, just proportionally enlarged beyond what any known medical condition would produce. The most compelling of these cases involve discoveries made by Smithsonian field agents themselves. In the institution's own Bureau of Ethnology, reports from the late 1800s, scattered among hundreds of pages of mound excavations, there are matter-of-fact descriptions of skeletons measuring 7, 8, even 9 feet in length. These aren't sensational newspaper accounts. These are dry, technical field reports documenting measurements, skeletal features, associated artifacts. And then those skeletons disappeared. Not metaphorically. Literally. The reports exist. The documentation exists. But the physical remains have no catalogue numbers, no storage locations. When researchers have requested access to these specific skeletons for examination, they're told no such items exist in the collection. 2 possible explanations emerge. 1. The measurements were mistakes. Even professional archaeologists in the 1800s lacked the rigorous standards of modern forensic anthropology. They might have measured from the top of the skull to the heel of the foot, rather than using the more accurate method of measuring individual long bones and calculating height from established ratios. They might have included headdresses or burial platform materials in their measurements. These are innocent errors that could inflate reported heights. 2. The skeletons were real, but they represented a problem for the emerging scientific consensus about human evolution and migration patterns, a problem for the narrative of progress and development that was being constructed in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and so they were quietly removed from the record, not through some grand conspiracy, but through a series of small, understandable decisions by individuals who believed they were protecting scientific integrity from what they saw as anomalous and misleading data. Or 3. And this is where we enter the realm of conspiracy. The skeletons were real, and they represented something so fundamentally challenging to established thinking that they had to be suppressed, not just removed from display, but actively hidden, stored in facilities that researchers can't access, their existence denied because acknowledging them would open questions that the gatekeepers of orthodox history and science are not prepared to answer. Which explanation you find most compelling probably depends on your prior assumptions about institutional honesty and the nature of scientific consensus. What's undeniable is the pattern. Discoveries reported, evidence documented, remains sent to centralized institutions, trail goes cold. Whether through accident or design, we have been left with questions instead of answers, with gaps in the record where clarity should exist. The Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, passed in 1990, requires museums and federal agencies to return Native American cultural items and human remains to their respective tribes. This is absolutely the right thing to do, an overdue acknowledgement of the unethical treatment of indigenous peoples and their dead. but it has created an unintended consequence for researchers seeking physical evidence of giants. Many of the skeletal remains that might have provided definitive proof, one way or another, have been repatriated and reburied according to tribal custom. This is as it should be. These were not specimens. They were people. But it means that the physical evidence, whatever its implications, is now beyond the reach of scientific examination. We are left with old photographs, many of questionable authenticity, old newspaper accounts, often sensationalized, old field reports, sometimes detailed but without the bones themselves to verify. The trail doesn't just go cold, it ends, and so we find ourselves in a strange epistemological space. We have ancient texts from multiple cultures describing giants. We have oral traditions from indigenous peoples around the world, speaking of encounters with beings of enormous size. We have scattered archaeological reports from the 19th and early 20th centuries documenting the discovery of unusually large human skeletons. And we have the absence of definitive physical proof, an absence that can be explained by innocent causes or by deliberate suppression, depending on your perspective. What we don't have is certainty. And perhaps that's appropriate. Perhaps the giant question, like so many of the deepest mysteries, is meant to remain in the liminal space between knowledge and speculation, a question that forces us to examine what we think we know and why we think we know it. Let's return now to the theological and mythological dimensions of this story, because they provide a framework that might make sense of all these disparate pieces. If the Nephilim and the Anunnaki are indeed connected, if they represent the same phenomenon of divine-human hybridization viewed through different cultural lenses, then several things follow. First, the flood narratives take on new significance. The biblical flood, the Mesopotamian flood described in the Epic of Gilgamesh, the Atrahasis epic, and dozens of other flood myths from cultures around the world all describe a cataclysm that destroyed nearly all life on Earth. In the Genesis account, the flood comes because the earth was corrupt and filled with violence. In the Book of Enoch, the flood comes specifically to destroy the Nephilim and cleanse the earth of the corruption caused by the Watchers. In the Sumerian account, the flood is sent by Enlil to reduce the human population that has grown too numerous and too noisy. Different motivations, but the same basic event. A world-destroying deluge that represents a cosmic reset button. If we take these accounts seriously, not necessarily as literal history but as preserving a memory of actual events, then something happened in the deep past that was bad enough to require the destruction of most of humanity. The presence of hybrid beings, of Nephilim or Anunnaki-Human offspring, might have been that trigger. Why would hybridization be seen as so terrible? From a biological standpoint, if we're talking about different species attempting to interbreed, the offspring would likely be sterile or suffer from serious genetic problems. But if we're talking about something else, about spiritual contamination, about the mixing of the earthly and the divine in ways that violated the fundamental order of creation, then the theological objection becomes clearer. In both the Hebrew and Sumerian traditions, there's a clear boundary between the divine and the human. Humans are meant to be mortal. We live, we die. Our time on earth is brief. The divine, whether you call them gods or angels, exist outside of time in some way. They don't die. They don't age. When that boundary is crossed, when the eternal mingles with the temporal to create something that is neither one nor the other, the result is an abomination. Not in the moral sense of being evil, though the Nephilim certainly became that, but in the ontological sense of being a category error, a thing that should not exist. The flood, then, is not punishment, it's correction. It's an immune response, the cosmos rejecting a foreign element that threatens the integrity of the whole system. And like any immune response, it's indiscriminate in its violence. Everything must be washed away so that creation can start fresh. But the texts suggest the cleansing was incomplete. In Genesis chapter 6, verse 4, there's a crucial phrase that's often overlooked. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God came in to the daughters of man, and they bore children to them. Also afterward. After what? After the flood. This single phrase suggests that the hybridization happened twice, once before the flood, producing the Nephilim, who were destroyed, and once after, producing a second generation of giants who appear in later biblical texts. When the Israelites send spies to scout out the promised land of Canaan, the spies return terrified. They report that the land is inhabited by the Anakim, descendants of the Nephilim, giants so large that we seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and we looked the same to them. This is roughly 1400 BC, long after any biblical flood, and yet, giants. Goliath of Gath, the famous giant slain by David, is described as standing over 9 feet tall. He had 4 brothers, all of them warriors of unusual size. One is described as having 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot, 24 digits in total. Is this evidence of genetic anomaly, perhaps from inbreeding in an isolated population, or is it evidence of something else? Some remnant of the hybrid bloodline expressing itself in physical ways that mark its bearers as different. In the ancient world, size was associated with power, and power was associated with divine favor or divine ancestry. Kings and heroes were often described as being larger than ordinary men. This could be purely metaphorical, a way of saying they were greater, more impressive, more capable, but it could also preserve a memory of actual physical differences. If the ruling class in ancient civilizations really were, on average, taller and stronger than the general population, that could be explained by better nutrition and less physical stress. Or it could be explained by genealogy, by a bloodline that traced back to the time when gods and humans mingled. The hero cults of ancient Greece revered the bones of legendary warriors, often displaying them in temples. Modern archaeology has examined some of these relics and found them to be the bones of extinct megafauna, mastodons, and cave bears, mistaken for human remains. But not all have been explained this way. Some ancient Greek and Roman accounts describe the discovery of human bones of extraordinary size, bones that were measured and documented by educated observers who had no reason to fabricate or exaggerate. Are all of these accounts mythology? Are all the measurements errors? Or is there, buried beneath layers of exaggeration and misidentification, a kernel of truth? A population or populations of unusually large humans that existed in the ancient world and were eventually absorbed into the general population, leaving behind only genetic traces and fading memories? The question brings us back to the present, to the bones in museum basements, to the stories that won't die, to the conspiracy theories that persist despite official denials. Let's examine specific cases that defy easy explanation. In 1883, the Smithsonian Bureau of Ethnology dispatched a team led by Professors Norris and Thomas to West Virginia to conduct extensive excavations of the 50 major burial mounds documented in the Charleston, Wheeling, and Moundsville regions. These were not amateur archaeologists. These were trained scientists operating under official institutional sanction with explicit instructions to document their findings with precision and care. Their reports, published in the Smithsonian's own annual bulletins, describe the discovery of multiple skeletons measuring between 7 and 8 feet in length. One individual was documented at 7 feet 6 inches, adorned with heavy copper bracelets and surrounded by elaborate burial goods, suggesting high status. In another mound, they found a circle of 10 skeletons surrounding a central giant skeleton, a burial arrangement that implied reverence, ritual, special treatment for someone who was clearly not an ordinary member of the community. The reports describe underground vaults constructed with engineering sophistication that surprised the investigators. Copper and mica, ornaments of exceptional craftsmanship, religious artifacts that suggested complex ceremonial practices, and consistently, across multiple sites, skeletal remains that exceeded the normal range of human height. These are not newspaper sensationalism. These are official government scientific reports. And yet, when modern researchers request access to examine these specific skeletons, they're told the items cannot be located. No catalogue numbers exist. No storage facility has any record of receiving them. The documentation persists, but the physical evidence has vanished as completely as if it never existed. Similar patterns emerge from excavations on Catalina Island off the coast of California. In the 1920s, amateur archaeologist Ralph Glidden conducted extensive work on the island, uncovering what he described as a massive burial complex containing thousands of skeletons, many of unusual size. Glidden claimed to have found evidence of a succession of kings and queens, some measuring over 9 feet tall, buried with elaborate grave goods in what appeared to be a sophisticated burial chamber system dating back thousands of years. Glidden created a museum to display his findings, photographed extensively, and invited prominent scientists to examine the collection. For a brief period, his museum was a tourist attraction, visited by thousands who viewed the unusual skeletal remains and artifacts. Then, according to various accounts, representatives from the Smithsonian visited the collection. Shortly after, Glidden's museum was closed. The collection was dismantled. The bones disappeared. Most of the photographs were lost. Though a few controversial images continue to circulate online, their authenticity disputed, but never definitively disproven. The pattern repeats in Lovelock Cave in Nevada, where the Paiute legends of the Sea Tekar giants appear to have archaeological corroboration. Early excavations in 1911 and 1912 documented the discovery of mummified remains with red hair, an unusual feature for the Native American populations of that region. Some of these remains were reportedly of significant size, though exact measurements are disputed because the excavation protocols of that era were less rigorous than modern standards. What's not disputed is that the cave was used for burial, that unusual artifacts were found, including duck decoys so sophisticated that similar designs weren't created by Euro-American duck hunters until the 20th century, and that the Paiute oral traditions, recorded before any archaeological work took place, accurately describe details about the cave and its contents that were only later verified by excavation. The bones from Lovelock Cave were distributed to various institutions. Some went to the Nevada Historical Society. Some allegedly went to the Smithsonian. When researchers in recent decades have attempted to track down these specific remains for examination, particularly to test the red hair for DNA analysis that might reveal ethnic origin, they've encountered the same pattern: missing catalogue numbers, lost records, bones that cannot be located. One might argue that this is simply institutional incompetence, that large museums with collections numbering in the millions of items inevitably lose track of some specimens, especially those acquired in the early days of American archaeology when record-keeping was less systematic. This is undoubtedly true. Museums do lose things. Collections are misidentified, mislabeled, stored in the wrong location, damaged or destroyed by water leaks, fire, pest infestations, but the pattern is troublingly specific. It's not that museums have lost random items, it's that they've specifically lost the items that would provide physical evidence for the giant hypothesis. The unusual skeletons, the oversized bones, the remains that don't fit the accepted narrative of human physical development. These are the items that have gone missing, while vast numbers of ordinary human remains from the same excavations have been carefully preserved, catalogued, and made available for research. This selectivity suggests something beyond mere incompetence. It suggests curation, whether conscious or unconscious, a filtering process where evidence that challenges prevailing theories is quietly excluded from the permanent collection, while evidence that confirms those theories is carefully preserved. If you were a keeper of secrets, if you were tasked with maintaining social order and preventing panic, how would you handle the discovery of evidence that challenged fundamental assumptions about human history and origins? You would probably do exactly what the Smithsonian is accused of doing. You would quietly remove the problematic evidence from public view. You would deny its existence or provide alternative explanations. You would dismiss those who asked uncomfortable questions as cranks and conspiracy theorists. You would protect the official narrative, not out of malice, but out of a sincere belief that the truth, or what you perceived as the truth, was too dangerous or too disruptive to be released. Consider the timing. The major suppression of giant skeleton evidence, if indeed that's what occurred, began in the late 19th century and intensified in the early 20th. This was the era when evolutionary theory was becoming established scientific consensus, when the narrative of human development from primitive ancestors through gradually increasing sophistication was being solidified, when anthropology was defining itself as a rigorous scientific discipline distinct from the armchair speculation and racial theorizing that had characterized earlier approaches. In this context, giant skeletons were problematic for multiple reasons. They suggested discontinuity rather than gradual development. They implied that ancient populations might have been fundamentally different from modern humans in ways that challenged evolutionary gradualism. They resonated with biblical narratives of giants that scientific rationalism was trying to move beyond. They provided ammunition for creationists, who wanted to use any evidence of anomaly as proof that evolutionary theory was incomplete or incorrect. So there was tremendous institutional pressure to explain away the giant evidence, to find naturalistic explanations that would preserve the established framework. Mastodon bones, medical conditions, measurement errors, hoaxes. Any explanation was preferable to the acknowledgement that the ancient world might have contained human or human-like beings of radically unusual proportions. Major John Wesley Powell, who became director of the Smithsonian's Bureau of Ethnology in 1879, explicitly promoted an evolutionary, pro-development agenda. He wanted to demonstrate that Native American cultures had developed independently and progressively, that the mound builders were not some mysterious lost race, but the ancestors of contemporary indigenous peoples. Any evidence that suggested discontinuity, lost advanced civilizations, or populations fundamentally different from modern humans contradicted this agenda and was therefore suspect. Powell's influence shaped American archaeology for generations. The institutions he built, the protocols he established, the paradigms he promoted, became the foundation for how American prehistory was studied and understood. If his agenda required minimizing or explaining away evidence that didn't fit, that's exactly what happened. Not through direct orders or explicit conspiracy, but through the subtle mechanisms of peer pressure, institutional culture, and paradigmatic thinking that shapes what questions get asked, what evidence gets preserved, and what interpretations get published. This is the tragedy of institutional secrecy. Even when it's motivated by good intentions, by a desire to prevent panic or maintain social stability, it breeds mistrust. It turns citizens into skeptics and skeptics into conspiracy theorists. It creates a situation where people are willing to believe the wildest alternative explanations because they've lost faith in the official ones. This is the tragedy of institutional secrecy. Even when it's motivated by good intentions, by a desire to prevent panic or maintain social stability, it breeds mistrust. It turns citizens into skeptics and skeptics into conspiracy theorists. It creates a situation where people are willing to believe the wildest alternative explanations because they've lost faith in the official ones. And maybe that's where we should land tonight as this story winds toward its close. Not with certainty, not with definitive proof one way or another, but with an acknowledgement that the questions are legitimate, that the ancient texts, whatever their origin, describe something that troubled the people who wrote them, that the oral traditions of indigenous peoples deserve to be taken seriously as historical accounts, rather than dismissed as primitive superstition, that the archaeological record, incomplete and contested as it is, contains enough anomalies to warrant continued investigation rather than premature closure. Whether the Nephilim were fallen angel-human hybrids, whether the Anunnaki were extraterrestrial visitors, whether these are two names for the same phenomenon or entirely separate myths that happen to share thematic elements, we may never know with certainty. The physical evidence is gone, repatriated, or lost or hidden. The textual evidence is ambiguous, open to multiple interpretations. The genetic evidence is suggestive, but not conclusive. What we're left with is the power of the story itself. The idea that in the deep past, something happened that was so profound, so disturbing, so world-changing, that it had to be preserved in myth and legend. That the boundaries between different kinds of beings were once more permeable than they are now. That hybridization occurred, and its consequences were terrible enough to require divine intervention to correct. This story speaks to something fundamental in human consciousness. The sense that we are not quite what we should be, that we are fallen in some way, separated from something greater, marked by an original transgression that echoes through all subsequent generations. Different cultures express this differently. The Christian doctrine of original sin, the Greek concept of the fall from a golden age, the Hindu cycle of yugas, each age worse than the one before. The sense that we once lived in a time of direct divine presence and have since been cut off, left to make our own way in a world that barely remembers what it once was. If the Nephilim were real, if they were the physical embodiment of that transgression, that forbidden mixing of the divine and the human, then their destruction would not have solved the fundamental problem. The knowledge of what had been done would remain. The consequences would ripple forward through time. The world after the flood would be different from the world before, not just in population but in nature. Something would have been lost, something would have been corrupted, and humanity would carry that corruption forward in our very DNA, in our capacity for violence and creation in equal measure, in our strange status as beings who are capable of contemplating the infinite while being trapped in finite, deteriorating bodies. The giant bones, if they exist, are not just archaeological curiosities. They would be evidence of that original crime, proof that the myths are not myths. Validation for every uncomfortable question about human origins that mainstream science has tried to close. This is why they would be dangerous. Not because of what they are, but because of what they represent. A crack in the edifice of certainty, a suggestion that the story we tell ourselves about who we are and where we came from might be radically incomplete. And so the mystery endures. The giants in the earth, whether they were 9 feet tall or 50 feet tall, or merely metaphorical giants of character and accomplishment, continue to haunt our collective memory. The Watchers, bound in their subterranean prison, according to Enoch, or departed on their celestial chariots, according to Sitchin, remain absent but not forgotten. The Nephilim, destroyed in the flood but returning afterward, or persisting in diluted bloodlines through the ages, refuse to stay dead. They persist in our stories, in our myths, in the whispers of suppressed evidence and hidden truths, in the bones that were found and lost, documented and denied. In the ancient texts that scholars assure us are purely metaphorical, while never quite explaining why so many different cultures would choose to tell metaphorically similar stories about giants and floods and divine human hybridization. Perhaps the truth is simpler and more strange than either the believers or the skeptics imagine. Perhaps there were beings in the ancient world who were different from us in ways we can no longer easily measure, not because they came from space or fell from heaven, but because the genetic variability of early human populations was far greater than what has survived to the present. Populations that were isolated for thousands of years, developing unique characteristics, including potentially unusual size, populations that would have seemed like giants or gods to their more typical neighbors. Populations that eventually were absorbed back into the genetic mainstream, leaving only traces in old bones and older memories. This explanation doesn't require angels or aliens. It requires only time and isolation and the statistical fact that in large enough populations, extremes will occasionally emerge. Given enough generations, given enough geographic separation, those extremes could become stable population traits. And when isolated populations finally meet, when the 7-foot-tall descendants of one group encounter the 5-foot-tall members of another, the size difference would be dramatic enough to seem supernatural, divine, other. But even this more naturalistic explanation leaves questions unanswered. Why the consistent pattern of these populations being described as violent, destructive, eventually exterminated or driven out? Why the association with forbidden knowledge and civilization-building skills? Why the flood narratives that specifically connect giants with cosmic transgression and divine judgment? The mystery remains. And as your mind begins to drift now, as the weight of sleep starts to pull you down into that comfortable darkness, perhaps that's exactly how it should be. Perhaps the giants are meant to remain at the edge of knowing, figures glimpsed in peripheral vision, present in the stories we tell, but absent from the physical world we can measure and catalogue and control. They remind us that history is not as settled as we pretend, that the past holds secrets we have not yet recovered, that the oldest texts might be trying to tell us something true even if we've lost the context to understand what that truth is. They remind us to stay curious, to question consensus, to hold space for mystery, even in an age that tries to explain everything. The Nephilim and the Anunnaki, whether they are fallen angels, extraterrestrial visitors, genetic hybrids, or simply unusually large humans mythologized by frightened neighbors, serve a function in human consciousness that goes beyond their literal existence or non-existence. They represent the unknown, the dangerous, the reminder that we might not be the pinnacle of creation, that there might be or have been things larger, stronger, more powerful than us. And perhaps that's the real reason the evidence has been suppressed, if indeed it has been. Not because of some grand conspiracy to hide the truth, but because humans desperately need to believe we are in control, that we understand our world, our history, our place in the cosmos, that there are no giants in the earth anymore, that the gods have departed, that we are alone and safe and masters of our own destiny. The bones in the basement, the tablets in the archives, the myths in the old books, they all suggest otherwise. They whisper that we are not alone, that we never were, that our heritage is stranger than we know, and that the giants, in one form or another, might still be among us. Their bloodline diluted but not disappeared, their story told but not believed, their secrets kept but not forgotten. Sleep well, knowing the mysteries endure. Knowing that for all our science and skepticism, there are questions we still cannot answer. Knowing that the giants, whether in flesh or in memory, still walk the corridors of our collective unconscious, waiting for the day when we're finally ready to acknowledge what our ancestors tried so hard to tell us. The story of the Nephilim and the Anunnaki is not over. It's merely sleeping. Like the Watchers in their subterranean prison. Like the memories of giants buried in shallow graves across forgotten continents. Like the truth that waits, patient and implacable, for someone brave or foolish enough to excavate it. Until that day comes, if it ever does, we have the persistent, nagging sense that something happened in the deep past, that we've lost but not forgotten, something that shaped us in ways we don't fully understand, something involving size and power and the forbidden mixing of things that were meant to stay separate, something that required a flood to wash away, but left behind echoes that still ripple through our myths and our genes and our dreams. Let those echoes carry you now. Let the mystery wrap around you like a comfortable blanket. The giants are gone, the Watchers are bound, the Anunnaki have departed, the flood has receded, and you, descendant of survivors, carrier of ancient bloodlines, both ordinary and potentially extraordinary, dream of ziggurat towers reaching towards stars, dream of beings striding across landscapes on legs like pillars, dream of secrets written in clay and hidden in mountain caves, dream of a time when the earth was young and wild and anything was possible, dream of giants. Beyond the borders of the Middle East and North America, the story of giants echoes through every continent, every ancient civilization, every culture that left records of their understanding of the past. This universality is perhaps the most compelling aspect of the giant narrative. It's not confined to one religious tradition or one geographical region. It appears everywhere. Humans have told stories about the time before time, the age before the present age, the world as it was before it became the world we know. In ancient Greece, the Titans were described as beings of enormous size and power, who ruled the cosmos before the Olympian gods overthrew them. These weren't simply large humans. They were primordial forces, beings who predated the current order of the universe. The Titan Cronus, leader of this older generation, was said to devour his own children to prevent them from challenging his rule. Only Zeus escaped, eventually growing strong enough to lead a rebellion that cast the Titans into Tartarus, a prison deep beneath the underworld where they remain bound in chains of adamant. The Greek historian Plutarch, writing in the 1st century AD, recorded accounts of giant bones being discovered across the Mediterranean world. He describes how the Roman general Sulla, while campaigning in Greece, was shown what were claimed to be the bones of heroes from the Trojan War. These skeletons were reportedly of extraordinary size, preserved in tombs that had been opened by earthquake or excavation. Plutarch, educated and skeptical, didn't automatically dismiss these accounts as fraud. He documented them as curious phenomena worthy of investigation. Pliny the Elder, the Roman naturalist whose encyclopedic natural history attempted to catalogue all known phenomena in the 1st century AD, devoted sections to reports of giant human remains. He described bones discovered in Crete that, when measured, suggested beings over 30 feet in height. He mentions discoveries in Sicily, in North Africa, in various parts of what was then the Roman Empire. Pliny was no credulous fool. He understood the difference between myth and observation, between hearsay and documented fact. Yet he included these accounts in his systematic treatment of the natural world, suggesting he found them at least credible enough to record. The ancient geographer Pausanias, travelling through Greece in the 2nd century AD, recorded numerous locations where giant bones had reportedly been found and subsequently enshrined as sacred relics. The inhabitants of these places claimed the bones belonged to legendary heroes, the demigod warriors who fought in the great battles of Greek mythology. Pausanias describes visiting these shrines, seeing the bones himself, and while he expresses some skepticism about their attribution to specific legendary figures, he doesn't question that the bones themselves were of unusual size. Were all of these accounts misidentifications of extinct megafauna? The Mediterranean region was once home to dwarf elephants, cave bears, and other large mammals whose bones, when fragmentary and weathered, could resemble oversized human remains. This is undoubtedly the explanation for many such discoveries. But the sheer number of reports, the care with which some were documented, the fact that educated observers who had seen both elephant bones and human bones continued to describe these finds as giant humans rather than animals, all suggest that at least some percentage of these discoveries represented something else. In Norse mythology, the Jotun, or frost giants, are primordial beings who preceded and eventually will outlast the gods themselves. They live in Jotunheim, a realm separate from but connected to the world of humans and gods. The relationship between the Aesir gods and the Jotun is complex, involving both conflict and intermarriage. Thor, the thunder god, is famous for battling giants, yet his mother is herself a giantess. Odin, the Allfather, has giant ancestry in his lineage. The boundaries between giant and god are permeable in Norse cosmology, suggesting these categories represented something other than simple physical size. The Norse Ragnarok, the twilight of the gods that will end the current age of the world, involves the giants finally overcoming the gods in a final catastrophic battle. The world will be consumed by fire and flood, then reborn, clean and new. This cyclical destruction and renewal, triggered by the conflict between divine and giant forces, parallels the flood narratives of the Middle East, but with a distinctly northern European character. Archaeological excavations in Scandinavia have occasionally turned up unusually large human remains, though not on the scale described in mythology. More intriguingly, the region is dotted with megalithic structures, massive stone constructions that require organizational and engineering capabilities that challenge our assumptions about Bronze Age Northern European societies. Local folklore consistently attributes these structures to giants, claiming they were built in the time before humans dominated the land. Modern archaeology proves that humans built these structures, but the question remains why ancient cultures would attribute such achievements to a different, larger race of beings rather than taking credit themselves. In Ireland and Scotland, the Fomorians fill a similar role. They're described as monstrous giants, sometimes with animal features, who inhabited the islands before the arrival of the Tuatha Dé Danann, the divine race of Irish mythology. The conflicts between these groups, preserved in texts like the Lebor Gabala Eren or Book of Invasions, describe a series of waves of settlers, each displacing or absorbing the previous inhabitants. The Fomorians, in this telling, weren't simply large humans but representatives of an older, more chaotic order that had to be overcome for civilization to flourish. The Giant's Causeway in Northern Ireland, a remarkable geological formation of basalt columns created by ancient volcanic activity, is attributed in folklore to the Irish giant Finn MacCool, who supposedly built it as a pathway to Scotland to fight a rival giant. This attribution of natural wonders to giant activity is common across cultures. Mount building, stone circle construction, the carving of valleys and placement of boulders, all were explained by invoking beings of sufficient size and strength to accomplish such feats. Hindu mythology contains numerous accounts of Rakshasas and Asuras, powerful beings often described as giants who opposed the gods and threatened humanity. The epic Ramayana describes Ravana, the demon king of Lanka, as a being of enormous size and power who required the intervention of the god Rama himself to defeat. The Mahabharata, another foundational Hindu epic, includes detailed descriptions of battles between normal warriors and giants, providing tactical details about how to fight beings whose reach and strength vastly exceeded human norms. The Sanskrit texts known as the Puranas contain cosmological accounts that describe multiple ages or yugas, each characterized by different qualities and different types of beings. In earlier yugas, humans and gods were more directly connected, and beings of greater size and longer lifespan were common. The current Kali Yuga, the age of darkness and degradation, is characterized by the reduction of human stature, lifespan, and spiritual power. This isn't simply metaphorical. The texts describe this as actual physical diminishment, a gradual shrinking of the human form from the giants of previous ages to the relatively small beings we are now. Buddhist traditions preserved in Tibetan and Chinese texts describe similar patterns. Accounts of early ages, when humans lived for centuries and stood much taller than current populations. The gradual decline in both size and lifespan as the world moved away from the time of the Buddha's enlightenment. While modern Buddhism emphasizes these texts' spiritual and metaphorical dimensions, the original accounts are presented with the matter-of-fact tone of historical description rather than allegory. In China, the classic text Shanhai Jing, or Classic of Mountains and Seas, compiled over 2,000 years ago, contains descriptions of numerous kingdoms and tribes, some inhabited by normal humans and others by giants, dwarves, one-legged people, and various other unusual populations. Modern scholarship treats this as mythological geography, similar to the medieval European belief in dog-headed men and other monstrosities living at the edges of the known world. But the text presents itself as a catalogue of actual places that could be visited, regions that existed beyond the borders of Chinese civilization where different rules of nature applied. Japanese mythology includes the Oni, beings often described as ogres or demons, but characterized by enormous size and strength. They appear in countless folk tales as antagonists who must be overcome by clever heroes. Archaeological excavations in Japan have occasionally uncovered skeletal remains of individuals who exceeded 6 feet in height, unusually tall for ancient Japanese populations, whose average height was significantly shorter. These discoveries are explained as genetic variation or individuals from other populations, but local tradition sometimes identifies them as Oni or as evidence of the giants who once lived in the islands. In Africa, the mythology is more fragmentary, having been disrupted by centuries of colonialism and cultural suppression, but preserved oral traditions speak of giants throughout the continent. The Zulu of South Africa tell of the Agogwe, small, ape-like humans who live in the forests, but also of giants who once inhabited the land before the current populations arrived. The Dogon people of Mali have complex cosmological traditions that include accounts of multiple types of beings, some of normal human size and others of exceptional stature, all playing roles in the creation and development of the world. Australian Aboriginal Dreamtime stories, which preserve cultural memories stretching back potentially 50,000 years or more, include accounts of giant beings in the time of creation. The Wandjina spirits of northwestern Australia are depicted in ancient rock art as massive humanoid figures with large eyes and no mouths, beings who shaped the landscape and taught the ancestors the laws of living. Whether these represent actual encounters with a different population or are purely spiritual entities is debated, but the consistency of the giant theme across disparate Aboriginal groups suggests deep cultural significance. In Mesoamerica, the Olmec civilization, which preceded the Maya and Aztec, left behind colossal stone heads, massive sculptures of human faces that stand up to 11 feet tall and weigh up to 50 tons. Who these represent is unknown, but they're clearly portraits of specific individuals, leaders or rulers, whose features are rendered with remarkable realism and individual character. Why depict them at such enormous scale unless there was cultural memory or belief in the exceptional size of ancient rulers? The Aztec origin myths speak of multiple previous ages, or suns, each ending in catastrophe. with the beings who inhabited earlier ages being fundamentally different from modern humans. The Popol Vuh, the sacred text of the Quiché Maya, describes the gods' multiple attempts to create humanity, each attempt producing beings with different characteristics. Early creations were either too primitive, too intelligent, or too proud. The current humanity is actually the fourth attempt, created only after the destruction of previous, flawed versions. While the text doesn't explicitly describe these early humans as giants, other Mayan sources make reference to a race of large beings who lived before the current sun, before the current age of the world. Andean traditions from Peru and Bolivia speak of the Huari or Wari, giant beings who lived in the time before the Inca. Before the rise of organized civilization, the massive stone blocks of Sacsayhuaman and other megalithic sites are attributed in folklore to these giants, who are said to possess the strength to move stones weighing hundreds of tons without the benefit of modern machinery. While archaeology demonstrates that humans built these structures, the methods used remain subjects of debate, and the attribution to giants reflects genuine puzzlement about how such feats were accomplished. This global distribution of giant legends presents a fascinating problem. Either every human culture independently invented the same myth for their own psychological or social reasons, or the myths preserve distorted memories of actual phenomena. The independent invention hypothesis is certainly possible. Carl Jung's theory of archetypes suggests that certain images and narratives emerge from the collective unconscious, appearing in multiple cultures because they represent universal human experiences and psychological needs. The giant might be one such archetype, representing forces or powers that humans feel but cannot control, the overwhelming otherness of nature or the divine, or simply the adult world as experienced by children. But the details are strangely consistent across cultures that had no contact. Giants are almost always associated with the distant past, with ages before the current world order was established. They're almost always eventually overcome or driven out by gods or heroes, rarely persisting into the present age. They're frequently associated with forbidden knowledge, with teaching humans skills or information that proves double-edged, bringing advancement and corruption in equal measure. They're consistently described as beings of exceptional appetite, consuming vast quantities of food and sometimes turning cannibal when other resources are exhausted. These specific shared elements are harder to explain through independent psychological invention. They suggest either diffusion of the story from a common source, traveling through trade routes and cultural contact to spread across the globe, or preservation of actual memories, distorted and mythologized over millennia, but retaining a core of historical truth. The scientific study of mythology, comparative religion, and folklore has long grappled with these questions. Are myths purely imaginative constructions, or do they preserve historical memories in coded form? The work of scholars like Mircea Eliade, Joseph Campbell, and others has demonstrated that myths serve important social and psychological functions, regardless of their historical accuracy. They provide frameworks for understanding the world, templates for ritual and social organization, ways of transmitting cultural values across generations. But acknowledging the functional and symbolic dimensions of myth doesn't necessarily preclude historical content. Both can be true simultaneously. A story can preserve an actual event while also serving symbolic purposes, can encode real history within a framework of theological meaning, can be both true and true in different ways. The academic study of giants has generally dismissed the phenomenon as mythological, grouping giant narratives with other legendary beings like dragons, unicorns, and phoenix birds that clearly never existed in physical reality. Giants, in this view, serve as narrative devices, obstacles for heroes to overcome, personifications of natural forces, or abstract concepts like chaos or savagery, or the untamed wilderness. But dragons might preserve distorted memories of dinosaur fossil discoveries. Ancient peoples finding massive bones in the earth could reasonably conclude they came from enormous reptilian creatures. Unicorns might derive from rhinoceros, whose single horn and powerful build could be transformed through distance and storytelling into the elegant horned horse of legend. The phoenix's resurrection from ashes might encode observations of wildfire ecology, where certain plants and ecosystems regenerate specifically through burning. If these fantastic creatures can have roots in misunderstood natural phenomena, why not giants? If ancient peoples discovered skeletons of unusual size, whether from tall humans with medical conditions, from extinct megafauna misidentified as human, or from some other source we haven't fully considered, they would naturally incorporate those discoveries into their understanding of the past. The giants would become part of their historical narrative, beings who really existed in the before times, in the age of heroes and gods. The scientific challenge is distinguishing between myth and memory, between invention and preservation. Modern archaeology has developed sophisticated methods for analyzing ancient texts, identifying the historical kernels within legendary narratives. The city of Troy was once considered purely legendary until Heinrich Schliemann used Homer's Iliad as a guide and discovered its actual location. The biblical account of the Hittite Empire was dismissed as fiction until archaeological excavations confirmed its existence. The flood narratives of Mesopotamia were thought to be purely mythological until evidence of massive flooding events in the region was documented. Could the giant narratives similarly contain historical truth waiting to be excavated? The physical evidence is problematic, as we've discussed, but perhaps we're looking in the wrong places or in the wrong ways. Perhaps the evidence exists but hasn't been recognized as such. Perhaps it's been reinterpreted to fit more comfortable paradigms. Perhaps it's waiting in museum storage, catalogued under misleading labels, its significance unrecognized. Or perhaps the giants were not beings of physical enormity but of temporal enormity, individuals who lived so much longer than normal humans that they seemed giant in their accumulation of knowledge and power. If the antediluvian patriarchs of Genesis really did live for centuries, as the text claims, they would have dominated their societies in ways that short-lived individuals never could. A person who lived for 800 years would accumulate wisdom, skill, authority that would seem godlike to those who lived for mere decades. In this interpretation, giant is metaphor for temporal span rather than physical stature. This would explain why the Sumerian king lists record such impossibly long reigns. Not because the kings were physically large, but because they were temporally vast, living for millennia rather than decades. The gradual reduction in lifespan after the flood, from thousands of years to hundreds to the current human norm of decades, would represent either the loss of some life-extending technology or knowledge, the degradation of human genetics from some original robust state, or simply the mythological compression of many short reigns into a few long ones to satisfy the need for continuous dynastic legitimacy. But even this interpretation requires us to take seriously the possibility that ancient texts preserve actual information rather than pure invention, that the numbers, while perhaps not literally accurate, reflect something real about the past. And that's precisely what mainstream academia is reluctant to do, to grant these ancient narratives the benefit of the doubt, to investigate whether they might contain historical truth disguised in mythological language. And when you wake, you can decide for yourself what you believe, whether the stories are true, whether the bones were real, whether we are alone or whether our family tree has branches we never suspected, reaching up toward heaven and down into darkness, connecting us to mysteries we've spent thousands of years trying to forget. Sleep well. Let the ancient world fade into memory once more. Let the giants return to myth. Let the questions rest, unanswered but acknowledged. You are safe here. In this moment, in this quiet, dark, the flood is over, the judgment has passed. Whatever happened in those days, in the time before time, it's distant now. The world has been washed clean, or clean enough. The giants are gone, or hidden well enough that we need not fear them. The Watchers are bound, or departed, or perhaps never existed outside the fevered imaginations of ancient priests seeking to explain a universe they couldn't comprehend. Or perhaps not. Perhaps they're waiting. Perhaps the bloodline continues. Perhaps the secrets are real. Perhaps someone, somewhere, knows the truth and has decided we're not ready for it. Perhaps that's wise. Perhaps that's the greatest conspiracy of all. Not the hiding of evidence, but the decision that some truths are too heavy for humanity to carry. But that's a concern for tomorrow. For now, there is only rest, only the gentle pull of sleep, only the knowledge that the story continues, whether we're awake to follow it or not. Good night, wherever you are, whatever time it is, whatever truth you've decided to carry with you. May your dreams be populated by mysteries that don't frighten, by questions that don't demand immediate answers, by giants who remain safely in the distance, impressive and awesome, but no longer threatening. The ancient world recedes, the modern world fades, and in that space between, you drift, carried by stories older than cities, older than writing, old as the first humans who looked up at the stars and wondered what lived beyond the light. Sweet dreams. And remember, when you wake, to look for the traces, the stories, the bones that might still be hidden, the truths that wait for brave souls to excavate them. For now, though, rest. The giants can wait. They've waited this long. Good night.